Did you know we have a thriving global community of like-minded ancestral home cooks and homesteaders? Every day on our Discord forum, we are discussing what we're cooking, what we're growing, what we're thinking about, what our latest struggles are, and supporting each other to fully embrace this beautiful lifestyle. As a patron member, you can also choose to access an extra private podcast feed, which includes monthly intimate chats where Andrea and I talk in depth about what's happening in our lives and kitchens. There are over 90 recordings waiting for you there right now. In addition, we've got a massive collection of inspiring and helpful downloads for you, including many recipes and videos. And once a month, you'll get to visit with myself, Andrea, and the community as we come together live and in person. Visit ancestralkitchenpodcast.com for all the details on how to join us. Come be part of our world and change yours. What is ancestral eating? After 3 years of recording podcast episodes, Andrea and I thought it was about time we tackled this topic head-on. Because although the word ancestral has become much more mainstream since we started, there is still a lot of confusion about eating and living this way. In this episode, you will first hear us talk about what ancestral eating isn't, including how it's different from carnivore or paleo, before we get on to defining what ancestral eating is. We will explain that it's not prescriptive, it's a philosophy, and we will share what it means practically in our kitchens too. Andrew and I both eat ancestrally, but our diets and kitchens look different, and we will outline that for you before talking about who's who in the ancestral eating world and giving you accessible and fun ways to move forward in your own ancestral kitchens. Episode 100 is a huge milestone for us two ladies who just love cooking and eating this way. Please do share this episode and our podcast with anyone who you think would benefit from what we're up to. Thank you. Let's get on to it.
Welcome to the Ancestral Kitchen Podcast.
I'm Alison, a European town dweller living in England.
And I'm Andrea, living on a family farm in Northwest Washington State, USA.
Pull up a chair at the table and join us as we talk about eating, cooking, and living with ancestral food wisdom in a modern world kitchen. Hello, Andrea.
Hello, Alison. How are you?
I'm good. I'm better for talking to you. I'm home alone today. So It's kind of a bit strange. But good.
Yeah,
good.
It'll
How
be...
are you? Mm-hmm.
Oh, I'm good. And,
good.
Listeners know that we have complicated relationships with our podcasting equipment. So
I set it all up by myself.
Yeah. Look at that.
Amazing.
And you said you had to use pliers and situation.
Yep, exactly. But it's all sorted now, hopefully.
Yay.
Fingers crossed. So have you eaten yet?
I haven't had breakfast. I do have some tea here, and it's just it's an Earl Grey that I get just every once in a while. I get it. Do you remember Megan was talking in Discord about fill-up stores?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
Yeah. So this isn't like, it's kind of a fill-up store, but they have big jars of things. So you can bring in your own container and fill it up. So I just go and get, a little bit of tea every once in a while. And then the dairy where we get our raw milk just started doing raw cream. And obviously you can just separate cream off the top of milk, which is what we've been doing for years and years. Yeah. But Gary went yesterday and he was picking up a trailer of hay. And so I was like, go get me some of that cream. I just want to try having like fancy pre-separated cream. Yeah. So I'm enjoying it. So I don't know.
Got that in cream your tea?
Bad? Yeah. Do you guys not put cream in tea?
No,
Isn't that like
really.
No,
but I
like
do.
Milk or whatever, right?
Yesterday I had a tea with cream in it. But generally cream's for coffee, milk's for tea.
Weird. Well, cream is good for everything in my religion. So
yeah, I agree.
Maybe one day you can teach us about a proper tea.
Proper cup of tea. Maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Oscar Wilde
I don't
style.
drink a proper cup of tea, though. I only drink kind of Red Bush and things like that. So I'm probably not the best person to talk to about it.
Well, you probably know more about it than I do. Did you eat before we got on?
Yeah, I did. Mine was a bit of an experiment, actually. I think I mentioned late last year that my slow cooker blew up during lard making session. I just make too much lard.
With smoke and everything.
Yeah. Quite dramatic.
I like how it made the trek across the country, and then I was like, I can't.
I can't do it anymore. So that we tried to salvage it, tried changing fuses, doing this, doing that. Rob got the screwdrivers out and the pliers, but we couldn't. And so it had to be gotten rid of, unfortunately. And to replace it, I did a little bit of investigation and decided to get an Instant Pot instead of slow cooker. Indeed.
What?
So I now have an Instant Pot. I don't have the one with all the jilly jangles that does dehydration and air frying. Because I do have a dehydrator. So I don't. Yeah, they have one that does like everything ever in the world.
Yeah, and who wants to air fry something when you have lard on hand?
Well, exactly. That's what I thought. I didn't think I'd use the air fryer. And we've got a dehydrator, so no point. Yeah, but I got the one that you can pressure cook and you can slow cook and you can saute and, you can do porridge and rice and things in it and the pressure settings.
Oh, my gosh.
And so up until
dipping her toe in the 21st century.
I know. What? It's just like, really? Have I got something with the word instant in my kitchen? Really? Can I do this? Can I really?
Is it loud?
I know. So I did it. And up until now, we've only done oatmeal porridge in it, which has been quite successful. At the beginning, it was too watery. Sorted that out. So that's good. And I decided today I would have a bit of a play with it. So I had some lamb necks from the farmer. We're getting quite a good relationship with one particular farmer at the market, and I'm tending to gravitate towards his stall. He has lamb and beef and pigs. And so I bought some lamb necks from him, and I put the Instapot on saute to start with, which I've not done before. And then I sauteed some leeks and some celery and some mushrooms. And I tipped those out and I seared the meat in the pan, in the Instapan. And then I tipped the leeks and the mushrooms and celery back in, put in some beetroot, some sweet potato, some kale, and then water and a little bit of tomato paste. Stirred it all around, put the lid back on and set it to pressure cook for 40 minutes. And kept kind of suspiciously hanging around the kitchen in case something was going to go wrong, but it didn't.
Yeah.
And it tasted delicious. It was really nice. I let all the steam out afterwards, which took a long time, much more than cooking porridge in it. The steam was coming out for ages.
Yeah.
And I forgot, I put some peas in there as well from Hobmadods are a supplier of UK grains and pulses, and they have kind of heritage peas that used to be grown in England but aren't really grown in England anymore, apart from by them. And I've got a mix
dried peas?
Dried peas. I've got a mix of lots of different peas. Some of them are brown, some of them are green, some of them are yellow. And I soaked those last night and then put those in. And it was delicious. Really good. And I've got extra.
Wait, you soaked peas?
I soaked the dried peas in water overnight to rehydrate them before I put them in this morning. Yeah.
Okay, I don't know if I've ever soaked dried peas or not.
Oh gosh, really? Maybe I could have put them straight in then.
I'm not remembering that I ever have.
I was a bit worried about having hard
peas. Yeah, that would be gross. Peas is like the, y'all didn't have potatoes until like post-Tudor, right?
Yes,
so
that's right.
Peas was kind of the potato.
The thing.
Of the
peas
British.
Was in bread. Peas were in bread. Peas were in peas pottage, which is like just peas basically. And
peas porridge hot?
Peas were everything. Peas were
they're in all the old
peas, you lived on peas,
nursery rhymes and stuff.
Exactly.
They're kind of everywhere.
So, these are the heritage peas of England that people disdain now because they want the little tiny sweet fresh peas.
No, I want to find out about these heritage peas because if they're a heritage English pea, I'll bet they'd grow in my climate
Yeah, they probably do, actually. Maybe I'll send you the link.
Yeah, I'm curious.
Because they've got them on Hobmadods. They're quite articulate about the things that they grow, so I could send you the link.
Yeah. Ooh,
Definitely.
yes, please.
So it was yummy. And then I just put the rest in like a glass Tupperware container thing and froze it. And then
nice.
My husband Rob and Gabriel are away, and they'll be back, and then I can pull it out of the freezer and serve them it at the weekend without too much hassle, which will be lovely.
Love it.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Okay.
Well, Alison, tell the people a little bit about this apple
before
thing.
we start, it is the new year.
Okay.
And
yes. Yes. Happy New Year.
Exactly. It's the new year when this one is going out, 2025. And it seems crazy that we started the podcast like, 2021 or something. And we are still going, which is exciting. We are, listeners might have heard last year that our supporter community is coming off of Patreon that we've used for the last couple of years, this year, slowly, because kind of pushed by the fact that Apple are charging 30% extra. And so that would then be passed on to our lovely supporters, which we don't want. So Rob is building us an alternative. And you will hear throughout the year how that is going on, because it's going to be fabulous in the end. And it's going to mean that every single penny that supporters pledge towards the podcast will actually come to us making the podcast, which is nice, rather than going into someone else's pocket.
And because our expenses are basically equivalent, we don't really have any taxes. So that's nice.
Yeah, exactly. It's very, very nice, because that's it. It just goes into the big hole of making a podcast, and then we're like, hello, what happened
endless, bottomless pit.
I know. So Rob's busy building that for us. In the process of that, we have a newsletter. So do go to ancestralkitchenpodcast.com, and at the top of every page, you will see a sign up for our newsletter. This year, we are going to get that going regularly. So if you want to hear from us and have us in your inbox, then go and sign up there. So that's the kind of admin. This is our 100th episode, which feels like an absolute milestone, because I think back to when I was just like, I wonder if Andrea wants to do a podcast with me. I'll ask her. And, I was saying to Rob the other day, I remember the first time we talked on Zoom, and I remember saying to Rob just before we did the call, I'm a bit nervous. I'm not sure. Is this going to be a disaster? And, and I can't believe, thinking back, that I even thought that. And we are here.
Here we are.
The 100th episode, which is very exciting.
That's insane.
And thinking about what we wanted to talk about for the 100th episode, we kind of looked through our feed of all our episodes, and I kind of realised that we didn't have an episode on what ancestral eating is. You could kind of tell by looking back at the topics of what we covered, but I thought it would be really good for us to sit down together and talk about what ancestral eating is. It's kind of been pushed because I read a book by quite a famous English food writer, journalist, a couple of months ago, where in one of the chapters she started talking about ancestral food and ancestral eating. And in my opinion, she completely misdefined what ancestral eating was, and I got quite upset, as the people on Discord found out, and angry about it, because she described something that was not what ancestral eating is. So
we saw the fury.
Oh, you did. Because of that,
Alison,
I wrote
unleashed.
several articles on it, which will be in the show notes. And then we actually got a question from Nicole, who's one of our supporters, about ancestral eating. Could you read that for us, Andrea?
Yeah, I'm just going to read it just as she wrote it. Okay. Nicole said, I love this article. And that's the one you wrote, Alison. Thanks so much, Alison. I still feel like an ancestral eating 101 would make for a good topic, as any newcomer to the podcast would have a place to go get an overview. Also, some background info into often dropped names like Weston Price. She says, at first I wasn't sure if it was some kind of cult. Sally Fallon, Joel Salatin, etc. How you both came to Ancestral Kitchens, how you met, how your cooking styles differ based on what's available to you and your own personal palates, but are still considered ancestral. top podcast episodes that delve into the specifics, like the 20 steps. Mm-hmm. Also, GAPS is mentioned often and has since been explained to me, and I have the book, but I like how Andrea puts it on the KTC. Those are just my 2 cents.
Okay, brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you, Nicole, for that question, and thank you for prodding us to make this episode, because we're here today to kind of make clear what ancestral eating is. Before we get going, Andrea, we have a new review, a 5-star review from Apple. Could you read us that too?
Yes. No, Allison, you're going to like, this person's name is Herbal Tea Fiend. I love that. Okay. Instructive and encouraging. I happened to find this podcast when I was looking for cooking podcasts to download for long flight. It's a really good idea. I'm so glad I found it. I love to cook and to learn new cooking techniques, and I've gotten so many fun and delicious ideas from this podcast that align with how I want to eat to improve my health. Since I started listening, I've gotten into the habit of making milk kefir, beet kvass, fermented oat pancakes, fermented vegetables, bone broth, endless loaves of spelt bread, and have even rendered my own tallow. My fiancé is also a huge fan of my new cooking routines. Yes, I'll bet. That is awesome. Thank you for that review.
Yeah, thank you.
If you've been around ancestral food for very long or listened to the podcast for just a few episodes, you know liver is a superfood, and Allison and I both love it. You're looking at a food packed with vitamins A, K, a broad spectrum of B vitamins, CoQ10, bioavailable iron, plus many essential minerals. Liver is your first stop when seeking to gain energy and restore your health. Not only is it a delicacy and staple of traditional diets, it's the first thing most animal predators go for when they're hunting. Are you looking for a good way to work liver into your daily life, but getting it on the table just isn't happening yet or as much as you'd like? Or maybe, like I went through earlier this year, you're pregnant and you're pretty sick and not much food is staying down. This is where liver capsules come in. Allison and I are both supplementing our ancestral diets with liver capsules from One Earth Health. We get all the incredible benefits of liver, even when we're on the road, or preparing non-liver meals for our family, or we just can't get a hold of a liver, and the sourcing and preparation has all been handled for us. One Earth Health produces nutritious organ capsules from 100% grass-fed, New Zealand-raised cattle. Support the pod by purchasing through our link. You'll get 15% off your first order and 5% off subsequent orders. Go to ancestralkitchenpodcast.com/liver or check the show notes.
Okay, so let's get started with, first of all, what ancestral eating isn't. And I think I decided that this was a good topic for a blog that I wrote because of the confusion that I'd seen in B. Wilson's book. So I'm just going to kind of go through each of the things that I think ancestral eating isn't, so we can get clearer on what it actually is. So the first one is ancestral eating isn't eating the way your ancestors did, regardless of where you live. So by that, I mean that ancestral eating is about eating the food that grows by you, food that can be sustained naturally and well on the land that's outside where you live. Mm-hmm. Rather than it being eating what your ancestors ate, wherever they live, regardless of where you live. That is something completely separate called nutrigenics. So nutrigenics recommends that you eat a certain way based on the genes that you've inherited. So for example, if you're living in California, but your grandma came from Japan, nutrigenics would say you should be eating the stuff that your grandma ate in Japan. Whereas ancestral eating would say you're living in California, look around you, what grows in California, and eat that way. I know that nutrigenics is, it's an interesting field, and several people have asked on Discord, how much do we believe in it? What do we do? And that's a topic which is interesting to go into. But from our point of view, we are focused on ancestral eating, which is what's growing around you. Mm-hmm. Secondly, a lot of people often say that ancestral eating is eating the way your great-grandparents did. And I think that comes from, in 2008, Michael Pollan, who wrote some amazing books, said, "Don't eat anything your great-grandmother wouldn't recognise as food." And often we will quote that sentence, or you'll hear that sentence quoted, and people will say, well, that's ancestral eating. But that was written 15 years ago. And for many of us, especially those of us who live in the UK and America, our great-grandmothers were eating industrially made food. I mean, I really like old cookbooks, and I've got several from the early 1900s. My grandma was born in 1920. And her grandma, my great-grandma, was born in 1900. So my great-grandma probably might have used one of these books from the early 1900s, and they've got margarine in them. And we've talked about Crisco before on this show, and Andrea had an amazing rant about Crisco. If you are a Patreon, go back and find our extra episode on Crisco and the history and some of the books that Andrea shared on a video. In Crisco, which is the industrially processed replacement to fat such as lard, was launched in 1915. So date-wise, it kind of doesn't work to say great-grandmothers anymore. Mm-hmm. And I think that, even if we are eating the foods that our great-grandmas would recognise, like Michael Pollan's saying, such as, for instance, beef or pork or eggs, these days, the animals who produce that food are eating very different things to what they would have been fed in the past. And now our vegetables and our fruit are being sprayed with goodness knows what that didn't exist back then. So I think we need to kind of move beyond that great-grandmother idea of ancestral eating and say it means eating foods that come from a pre-industrial food system. So look at the foods that sustained our ancestors before profit became the thing that drives mainstream food, and before we had the transportation to be able to ship foods halfway across the world. Andrew, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I agree with everything you're saying. I don't want to stop this flow. This is good.
Cool. Okay. The next one we talked about quite a lot on here. Ancestral eating isn't about tying yourself to the kitchen and throwing out all your modern conveniences. So I have an Instapot now. I've got something with the word instant. And I used it today to cook some lamb's necks and some beautiful local vegetables. Just because we take the inspiration from our food supply and our preparation methods from those who came before us doesn't mean that we cannot use the options that the modern world has given us in the kitchen. So I think just a great example of this is grain. I was doing some research today for my oat book, and I was reading a book that was published in 1940 about the oats in Scotland and this guy who'd been growing oats in his family for centuries. And he was talking about how oats have been ground throughout history. And it's just such a good example of why we don't have to do what our ancestors did. So our ancestors would have toiled for hours and hours with grain. With oats, they're dried, and then they would have bashed them and shaken them to get the husks off. And then they would have had to start with 2 stones, one which they held in their hand, the other one which was either on the ground or kind of trapped, sort of set in the earth. And then they would have literally ground that grain with their right hand and a stone. And then you go forward a little bit to, I think, about 200 AD. Querns came on the scene, which were larger circular sets of 2 flat rounded stones, and the grains went in between them and you turned them. And it took hours and hours and hours to create just enough grain to make, 1 loaf of bread or 1 porridge, 1 pottage. Whereas now we have companies like the Mock Mill that have developed these ecological stone mills that give us all the benefits of the grain, that keep the oils there rather than industrial roller mills. And we can have them on our kitchen top to grind our grain at home. And they do that job in a fraction of the time that our ancestors used to spend. And Andrew, you've talked about this quite a lot, that we can have the best of both worlds these days. You talk about it a lot in regards to plumbing. We have plumbing We have stuff that can take the water away from our kitchen. We have grain mills. We have ovens. We don't have to get up and light an oven at 5 o'clock in order to cook anything. We can choose a way forward that both cares for and ensures the survival of our race, yet doesn't see us spend our whole day on food preparation.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's another kind of topic tied into this kind of being tied to the kitchen, which I wanted to ask you to talk about, Andrea, which was on Discord, some people who in our supporter community have said to us that they've received criticisms of ancestral eating in that it is inherently anti-female. You know, it keeps women down in the home with their aprons on. And I feel like you've got some really eloquent things to share around that. Could you talk to that for a little while?
Yes. So when people share that concern with me about this way of food being anti-female or keeping women down, they are coming at food from a totally modern perspective, which is something that you and I, have to be cautious about imposing on foodways when we look at ancestral foods in the past. So our modern society is much more physically equalized in that we have machines, we have services that do things for us now so that you can live today in a way that was not possible before. So imagine like just something as simple as a bachelor living on his own and still being able to eat hot food and have clean clothes. So as a funny example, think of the example of Sherlock Holmes. Mm-hmm. Everybody knows about this character, and he lived in a rooming house, which was a typical way for single men to live at that time, because literally functioning as a person, you know, having water, having hot water for tea, getting your linens washed, ordering food that had to come from a greengrocer or butcher every day because you have no refrigerator and you can't freeze things, or preparing meals on a wood stove that takes a lot of time. This is a lot more difficult for someone on their own up until very recently. And where you might once have needed to divide up skills across physical strengths, which I know you and I have talked about even in our life today. Yeah. There's lots of things that, you know, I'm not physically going to do and that Gary is. Yeah. But I think of the women, the women grinding their grains. And Allison, that was episode 82 on home milling.
Thank you.
And that's a really good episode if anyone wants to hear some just mind-blowing information about women grinding grains. It's certainly an enormously physical task. But the reason why they'd be doing something like that rather than hunting would be so they could, you know, there's a biological need to be close to your offspring and nurse them and let them sleep. And, you know, it's probably harder to chase a antelope with a baby tied to your back. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm just extrapolating here. So, but an interesting thing, Allison, is that when you say, not you, but, you know, when one says that this way of eating keeps women down, it's interesting to consider that women throughout history don't seem to have had that thought about what they considered a sacred role in society. So a friend of mine who comes from an Inuit tribe in the very north of Alaska told me that as part of her studies on Indigenous peoples, she went to Hawaii and participated in a whale hunt. So a part of that process, and she took a number of graduate students or something with her. And a part of that process was when the whale is on the beach, the men go down and start cutting it up to bring the pieces up, and the women start washing all the kettles and the pots and things. And the students said to the women, how come the men get to go cut up the whale and the women have to do this demeaning menial labor? And the women were shocked. And they said, what? This is like a sacred, holy job. Why would we not want to do this? This is so important to the survival of our traditions and our tribe. And I thought that was really interesting because they were imposing their modern view of why would you be in the kitchen when you could be, you know, in an office instead. And I also thought about a friend of mine who's Catholic told me that at Catholic Mass, she one day noticed, oh, it's the priest who's washing the dishes from the sacrament. And she just thought, wow, washing dishes is a holy activity. So I would start by saying that even if it is the woman who does the food preparation, it isn't that it's a lesser role to be kept down in. It's that in our modern factory-centric fast food, office-glorified consumer world, where you throw away the heels of the bread because you don't want it, we've devalued food itself and the running of a productive and orderly home. So those are the very things that civilization and all of human aspiration is based on. And incidentally, something that the very powerful Romans considered also a sacred role. And to speak to the physical equalization of society, it doesn't have to be solely the woman who tends to these matters in the home. I think I know almost as many men who bake bread as I do women. You know, it's not that, you know, sometimes the woman is actually earning more money and out and about or something, and the man is like, well, I'm doing the food. You know, it's because it's not that physical, you know, that physical, the woman's not like having to chase antelope for hundreds of miles or something. But if it is the woman who's taking care of the things at home because the circumstances in the couple's relationship demands that, then it is a valuable and sacred occupation still. I kind of suspect that people who think it's not valuable are actually themselves devaluing women. And they're saying, because women have always done this, it isn't as valuable. Yeah. And so it's this weird, like, actually, like, it's like you would think the feminist view would be, you know, get the woman out of the home, but it's actually respect the woman wherever she's at and whatever she's doing.
I completely agree with that. I feel like, you know, since industrialization and then the kind of the way that we've marched forward with individualism and the idea that you are fulfilled when you go outside and you earn money, then you will mean something, you know? Right. It's all about money. And that has just devalued completely the women's role in the house and how important that is, because our society does not value that kind of productivity. So I totally agree with you.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll just end this spiel, Allison, with mentioning the disturbing research that came out of Cornell, which was cited in Radical Homemakers, which is a book I've mentioned on this podcast a few times. There is a direct correlation to how much mothers work outside the home relating to the obesity and health problems of the children. And obviously, that doesn't have to be, you know, you could be a mother working full-time outside the home and also your children can have nutritious food. It's just that there is this trend that when the mother is no longer preparing food, then you kind of gravitate towards factory food, which you and I know is problematic. And if there is to be another generation and a healthy, fertile, strong generation, we need to value what we've been told is drudgery and being kept down in the home and food life as what it actually is, which is a priceless, sacred task.
Yeah, completely. You know, I feel like when I interact with patrons, whether it's on Discord or on our live chat that we do once a month, that all of the people that I speak to there don't feel like they're put upon. You know, they believe in what they're doing and they're so enthusiastic about it. They want to share it with people and they want to help answer questions and ask questions. And it feels like a community of really engaged, alive people, you know, not people who feel in any way put upon. And
no, I don't think so at all.
And that says it all to me, I think, really.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm glad that you were able to speak to that because it seems it's really important. I've got a couple more, I think. As in what ancestral eating isn't. And the next one is, it's not a romanticization of food ways of the past. I think it feels good, we know, to get closer to our food, to get our hands in the soil in our garden, to grow our own vegetables, to bake our own bread. But ancestral eating as a way of life doesn't romanticize the past. We're living in developed countries, and you and I are both aware of the unprecedented abundance that we live in. The people who came before us very rarely experienced this, and so many of them struggled throughout their lives just to have enough food to survive. The amount of kind of historical documents I've read where, the mother wasn't eating and she was feeding the kids, or the kids were just scraping the ends off the porridge bowl. Our ancestors, I have so much respect for them. And ancestral eating is an inspiration for me. I'm inspired by the food wisdom of those people, our forefathers. The way they cared for the soil, the way the food was so valuable to them. They didn't waste anything. The way they preserved their food. And so I hold that kind of amazing gratitude for where I am, and respect for the battles that my ancestors had and how they lived together. I'm not sitting here, with rose-tinted glasses on, thinking, everything was better in the past, because I know it wasn't necessarily at all.
Yeah. And you mentioned farther up the concept of eating what your genetic ancestors would have had as being a different field. And I would say also when you talked about not eschewing all the modern conveniences of electricity and plumbing, and then not romanticizing the foodways of the past, that's more related to a field called historical cooking, which
correct.
I think is really interesting also. I've seen people say, if you didn't cook this heritage porridge in a cast iron pot over a stove, then it wasn't ancestral cooking. And I totally disagree with that.
Yeah.
But I think that is historical cooking, which I think is really fascinating and can teach you a lot about ancestral foods when you do something, with the dishes or the means they had, and realize, this was maybe why they did it that way or whatever. So that field has its own value, which is different.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. The reason I kind of focused on this not romanticizing is because there was a big section in B. Wilson's book that said that ancestral eating romanticized the past. And I very often see, videos kind of shared around, sometimes on the Patreon community, from YouTubers who are into that historical cooking that you're talking about. And, like you said, there's a lot to be learnt from it, and we can take bits of that and use them in our own cooking practices. But whenever I look at those channels, I always just see the difference between what we're doing and what they're doing, and see how ancestral eating as we present it, living this way, is not just about taking a facsimile copy of the past and doing it. And the difference is the reason. The reason why we're doing it is to look after the soil, to be thrifty, to not waste, to care for the environment, to care for our bodies, to learn this wisdom that our ancestors had before chemicals, before global transport that just is coming in and just messing up everything. Right. And the difference between us and kind of historical food is that we have different kind of reasons for doing the way we do. And ancestral food is about taking the inspiration of our ancestors, not the letter, I think. Thanks for bringing that up, because I often think that. Okay, I think I've got one more before we get on to what ancestral food eating is.
This is a good one.
Which is, ancestral eating isn't about excluding grains. So the paleo diet excludes grains. Ancestral eating doesn't. People will tell us that farming grains began 12,000 years ago, but in fact, our ancestors have been eating grains for much longer than that. And just very recently, in the last couple of months, I've uncovered 2 bits of research which are going in my book, which is that in southern Italy, in Puglia, a pestle was uncovered by an archaeologist that was 32,000 years old. And when it was put in the lab and looked at, they found grains on there from the wild oat. And what was interesting about it was that the grains had been gelatinized, which shows that whoever was using that oat and eating that oat had done some processing to that oat in order to make it perhaps easier to cook or easier to digest, which is fascinating.
So that's that they can even
1,000 years ago. Yeah, go on.
I just love how confidently people say, "Oh, humans never did this," and then you unearth something, and it's like, "Oh, well, actually, never mind that." Why do we say so confidently things? We should just say we don't know if they were eating it then. We do know they were eating it here, but we don't know if it was prior to that or not. Hello.
Completely. There's another one a bit later on. So the Puglia one's the early one. A bit later on, archaeologists in Jordan, in the Middle East, found some granaries, and I've seen pictures of the granaries and how they, kind of think that they were built. And in one of those sites, there were 120,000 oat grains.
What?
Literally. So they were being cultivated. The oat grains were being grown in order to be eaten, and they were being kept in granaries which had floated floors to protect them from rodents.
What floors?
Like, wooden floors that were above the ground. So rats couldn't get in and take away or mice couldn't get in and take the grains away. So they were storing the grains.
If only there was a book about oats out there.
Anyway, back to this. So ancestral eating, which, we're defining as being inspired by pre-industrial food systems, can incorporate grain eating. As with other food groups, we look to the wisdom of the past to understand best practice. So our ancestors most often processed their grains before consuming by soaking and or fermenting. So grains did exist. Grains were eaten by our ancestors, and we can eat ancestral. As ancestral eaters, we can eat grains. But again, we look back and we're inspired by the way that they were processed, and we think about, okay, do we want to soak them? Do we want to ferment them? Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you have anything else to add to what ancestral eating isn't, Andrea?
No, that was solid.
No. Okay. So let's just take a quick ad break and we'll be back with what ancestral eating is.
Hey, you washing the dishes. Been there. You've heard Allison and I talk over and over about her love of rye sourdough bread. Well, I might actually call it an obsession, but that's neither here nor there. Now you can make Allison's rye sourdough in your own kitchen with her as your teacher. And she's a really good teacher. Rye is economical, it's delicious, and full of nutrients and low in gluten. There's a reason why it has been a darling of bread bakers for centuries. Make it into sourdough, as Allison will show you in her course, Rye Sourdough Bread, Mastering the Basics. And you've got an amazing, tasty, and nutritious staple in your kitchen. It's traditional and it's nutritional. In this course, you'll learn everything there is to know about how she creates and maintains her rye sourdough starter, all about whole grain sourdough rye, including the key differences between baking with rye and wheat, how to make 2 loaves, an everyday rye sandwich bread, and a delicious Russian-style dark rye loaf, and what to do with your sourdough discard, including video walkthroughs for sourdough pancakes and a tasty, sweet, spiced cake. Head to www.ancestralkitchen.com/rye.
Okay, so now we know what ancestral eating isn't. Let's talk about what ancestral eating is. All that we've talked about, you can see that it's not prescriptive. We are not saying eat this. And in the past, Andrea, I think maybe it was on a live chat that we did with patrons, you talked about ancestral eating as a philosophy, and I really liked the way you spoke about it. Could you share that with the listeners, please?
Yes, if I remember, this would have been our July KTC because it was my first one back after the baby was born.
Ah, okay.
Because I remember somebody handed me the baby while I was saying this. So I consider what you and I do work towards a philosophy of eating. And this was inspired by my study of Charlotte Mason, who's an education philosopher, just a philosopher in general. And by the way, Allison, she believed children needed beef tea, warm woolen clothes, and lots of fresh air.
Sounds good.
Which we agree with also.
Yeah.
But she wrote a book, and she actually called it Towards a Philosophy of Education, basically saying that, she couldn't even put down the definitive philosophy. It was only towards the direction of it. And people who are interested in Charlotte Mason's philosophy always ask me for the curriculum or the rules of Charlotte Mason, or what is the list of books. But what she has is a belief about the way humans are, which is great because that's all been discovered with neuroscience now. So we know that she understood the way we were learning correctly. And so she talked about the kind of food, she actually calls it a feast, that our minds feed on. And she said, spread a wide feast. And this is actually similar to the way you and I approach ancestral food, in that we believe in the diversity of different foods. You can find, there's positive strengths in that. So she, in suggesting that there's a way of doing things and not saying that there is a specific book or something to follow, then she teaches you a way of thinking that means you can go anywhere in the world. And this is why Charlotte Mason is so interesting, because it works everywhere, in every country, in every possible place you can think of, because it's a way of thinking. And you can access, just like we do with the ancestral foods, you can access things that support that way of thinking from anywhere in the world that fit the context of where you live. As a really silly example, I'll say that she believes in learning about the origins of the country where you live, not the origins of Britain per se or America per se, but the country where you live. And so if you're doing that, then you can apply that to anywhere. Just like with ancestral food, you could say, I believe in the importance of saturated fats and the health that those bring to our brains and the way our body works. And, you may live in Israel and you're not eating pork, but there's different saturated fats you can access. You may live in India and you're not eating beef, but there's different saturated fats you can get. And you may live up in Alaska and you only have access to, whale blubber or something, Yeah. So it's a principle that works anywhere. So I find it helpful to have these guiding principles that we're going to talk about, and instead of explicit rules like eat this brand of food, not that brand of food, or, don't ever eat grains. Well, maybe some people who are eating ancestrally won't eat grains. I mean, I have yet to hear of a polar cap tribe that lives off of grains. Yeah. And they're still eating ancestrally because it's not a rule that ancestral food has grains in it, but you follow these old principles that people survived on. Like you alluded to up above, a lot of people were mainly just starving to death all the time. So they figured out what was the most nutrient dense, what keeps us alive the longest, what makes our brains work, what helps us to have more babies so we can keep passing on our genetic code. And, how do we make sure that our fertility stays intact? So I like having a philosophy of eating rather than a list of rules, if that's making sense.
Yeah, no, it does. I think then what we'll do is we'll kind of talk through the tenets of that philosophy, kind of ideas. Okay. And I wanted to start this by reading the introduction that I wrote to a blog post, which is titled, "What Does Eating Ancestrally Mean?" Because when I read it, I thought, I can't say it any better than that. So I should just read it. So it says, a little over 200 years ago, the Industrial Revolution started a chain of events that has led to our disconnection from not only the source of our food, but also the thousands of years of handed down skills and wisdom surrounding it. These days, our food is in the hands of large corporations run by men whose aim is to make money. Yet food is so much more than money. The way we feed ourselves, our families and our communities is do or die fundamental to our bodily and mental health, our communities, our economies and our environment. Up until a few short generations ago, the ways we produce food enhanced those things. Our meals were made from what the local land could give and prepared with handed down wisdom. Since money took the reins, that has slowly disintegrated. And with that disintegration, we have lost so much health, so much connection, so much empowerment, so much knowledge. And at the same time as that loss, we have been slowly destroying the very source of our life, the soils, the earth, the environment. Eating Ancestrally aims to turn this around by choosing to step out of the industrial food system and instead learning from, practicing and eating the way our forebears ate. We can reclaim our kitchens, our health, our supply chain and our community. All whilst knowing we are doing something that, given half a chance, can restore the health of our world. In practice, eating ancestrally means looking at how pre-industrial cultures found, grew, prepared and ate food before profit and planes came into the picture, when human health and keeping the land fertile mattered. There is a lifetime's worth of wisdom in the kitchens of our past. Oh, I get off my high horse now. I feel all emotional reading that.
Alison, when you write that book, I'm buying 100 copies.
Oh,
I cannot wait until you write that book.
you need to get another bookshelf, possibly.
Yeah, I'll have the Alison bookshelf.
Oh, that's nice. Okay, so let's move on. So we're going to talk through kind of our ideas of what that inspiration is, what we take. And I feel like each of these, you could say at the end of it, like our ancestors used to do.
Right.
So the first one is eat what's local to you, in season, or preserve it, like our ancestors used to do. That obviously means cooking at home, not going and buying something that someone's made in a factory. Next one, consuming animals raised and fed naturally. Now, the amount of meat can vary. And, there's a book called Default Meat by Simon Fairley, where he talks about meat being a byproduct of an economy and ecology. And that's kind of one end of it, to much, much more. But I think as one of your idols, Andrea, who is just wonderful, Joel Salatin says, there is no such thing as an animal-less ecology. Animals are always there, whether we're eating a lot of them or a little of them, they're always there. The question here in this kind of tenor is raised and fed naturally. And I wonder, Andrea, how would you define naturally in that sentence?
Okay, so you can go historical and say, well, they'd have to be wild and be foraging. And you can also say, well, we live in a slightly different world than the one those people were living in, that they're making the flint arrowheads that Gabe picked up, or the flint chips. Our world has changed a little bit since then. And there are people raising animals. And kind of like I think Simon Fairley probably alludes to in his book, then, you can actually use animals to heal and build land and do things just for the sake of the animal existing on the land that is beneficial to other systems. And I guess like a funny default meat example might be the fact that we have layer chickens that we get eggs from.
Okay.
Which I do consider eggs meat, but when the layer chicken is no longer laying, then we butcher them.
Yeah.
And then we stew them and eat chicken soup. So otherwise, what am I going to do? Just, throw it in the woods or something. But I think naturally would be often trying to find what's closer to what that animal might eat. And then again, you have to consider the fact that we've been sexually selecting and breeding animals for a long time. And so, in very ancient types of cows, acres, very ancient cows, they wouldn't eat grain, right? They just had grasses. Yeah. They also didn't give much milk, and they, you didn't milk them 9 months out of the year like you do with a lot of cows now. Now we have cows that people have found over time, like the Jersey cow from a lot of great breeds that came out of Britain, actually. Dexters and Galloways and things like that. We have these cows that have been bred, and their breeding supports them eating a more modern cow diet, which often can include grains. Doesn't always have to, but often does. So I don't necessarily consider a cow that is fed grains to be not eating, you're getting that raw milk. I don't consider that to be not ancestral or not beneficial anymore. It's a kind of like using the mock mill to grind your grains. I'm like, well, it's a little different than how people did it, but it does make it so that everybody in the town can get milk. And, that's a good thing. So I would say avoiding the cows or the animals in general that are kept in factories, because that's really difficult on an animal. Avoiding animals that are fed diets that intentionally bloat and cause overweight in the animal. And getting animals that get to live in their animalness, like cows that get to walk on grass, and pigs that get to root under trees, and chickens that get to scratch in dirt and things like that. So I guess I don't have a super clear definition on that, because I think it can vary from place to place. But I think it would be the closest I could get. Yeah,
all the best answers in our world are nuanced. I do feel like
that's true.
The whole grain thing, a lot of people are just completely anti-grain. Researching in the last year, I found out that people started feeding turnips and vegetables like turnips and Swedes, rutabaga, to cattle in the Middle Ages. So it's not kind of just a recent thing. It's
because of those are the carbs. Those are
it's not just a recent thing where they've just been eating
any
grass,
nursing mother who's gone on GAPS knows what carbs do for your milk. Yeah, and exactly. You're a mammal, they're a mammal. It's pretty much the same thing. So,
and I do feel though that with the grain thing, that a cow that is fed a grain that's shipped in from South America, there's something very wrong with that. Flavio, the farmer that we used to have in Italy, his cows had some grain, but he was producing that grain himself or buying it from local farmers and sprouting it.
Right.
And so I feel there's a big difference between that and a cow that's fed, soy that's come from Argentina, for example.
But if you want to just be dogmatic and slap a label and say no grain-fed animal will ever come into my house, then I feel like that's missing the point a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, so do I. Thank you for that. Okay, so that was kind of saying consume animals raised and fed naturally. The next thing kind of moves on from that, which is eat all of the animal. So our ancestors ate all of the animals so as not to waste it, because why would you waste such a precious resource? And I feel like it's a respect for the animal too. So that means not necessarily just eating the offal, though it does include eating the offal. It means, using the head, it means using the fat, it means using the skin where you can, as much as possible, eat all of the animal. And that gives us a different nutrient profile to just eating muscle meat, as well as an incredible variety in our diet, which is amazing, I think. Next thing, use real fat. Something that we talk about a lot on the podcast. So who thought eating a waste product was a good idea. Oh, yes. The people who wanted to make money from it. Enter Crisco.
Yeah.
Fat is great eaten with food. It's there. It's part of a steak. It's part of, cuts from an animal. Stripping it off is such a recent idea. I remember when I was younger, kind of wanting to lose weight, and I was so anti-fat. I used to cut off all the fat from meat. I used to take the skin off a chicken breast, and people still do that, But in the past, fat was prized, wasn't it?
Yeah. Yes, that is true. And Alice and I do take the skin off of the chicken so that I can fry it and salt it and eat it. But that's probably not what they had in mind.
No, it just goes in the bin, I think. So, our ancestors used that fat for calories, used that fat to carry flavour, used that fat to help them insulate themselves, Nowadays, we have such a twisted notion around the idea of saturated fat. So fat from animals, and also seed oils aren't all bad. Minimally processed cold pressed seed oils, some seed oils can be used and have been used by ancestors. So that's fat. Processed grains, that was something that our ancestors did. They didn't do it all the time, as I'm learning with oats. Shock horror. So, I think, for example, I won't expand too much into the world of phytic acid, but phytic acid is known as an anti-nutrient because it can steal iron and calcium from you in the meal that you eat it, because it chelates to them. But phytic acid also has some positives. It's an antioxidant. It's been shown in some trials to help with cancers. It has some positives to it. And so I feel like, if you're eating oats 3 times a day and you're never fermenting your oats, you're never processing your grains, then you know what, you might have some problems because you're not going to be absorbing nutrients. But if you're only eating oats once every other day or once a day, and you process them sometimes and you don't process them other times, again, it's like the grains being fed to animals thing, it's like the natural food. It's a nuance, and it's something that as informed, conscious individuals, we can navigate through with common sense rather than, like you said, slapping something on that says you've always got to do this.
And probably you're the only person here who would actually eat grains or oats 3 times a day. So,
possibly. Yeah, exactly.
I wouldn't be surprised if you did. But
no, I have to stop. I've got all these things that I'm making. I have to be like, no, I've eaten oats too much today. Come on. I'm only trying to have them once a day at the moment. So if you want to come over and eat some oat things, you can. Okay. Last one here is include fermented foods. Now, probiotics are expensive to buy in a jar, but they are not expensive to make yourself. We have an episode about that, which is called The 5 Cheapest and Yet the Most Expensive Foods, which will talk about some of the fermented foods which you can include. Do you love oats? Want to try your hand at a traditional Scottish oat fermentation? Suans is just that. It was made in Scotland for centuries and will give you both a creamy, easy to digest porridge and a tangy probiotic drink. My video course, Suans, the Scottish Oat Ferment, over at the Fermentation School, will guide you through everything you need to know to create these 2 ancestral foods in your own kitchen, no matter what equipment you have. Head to ancestralkitchen.com/Suans, ancestralkitchen.com/Suans, SOWANS, or click the link in the show notes to get a 10% discount automatically applied. So, the next thing is kind of pulling on part of the question that Nicole had, which is that both Andrea and I eat ancestrally, but what we eat differs. What our supporters that we talk to in Discord every day eat differs. And what you as a listener, what you eat in Australia or in Alaska or in Israel, like you were saying, in South America, all over the world it differs. And just to give some examples of that, Andrea has better access to dairy over there. She can get raw dairy where she is, as she was saying earlier on in the episode. And she's got more tolerance for dairy. You've got more tolerance for dairy than me. So you have more dairy in your diet. Us, on the other hand, we don't have probably so much butter as you, but we have a lot of lard, because I can access a lot of lard, and I love rendering, and I love doing cooking with it, and I love spreading it on bread. And so probably we eat more lard than you, although I've not done a head-to-head test of how much lard you eat compared to me. Andrea's got her farm there. You've got your farm, you've got animals, and you are processing those animals. Whereas Rob and I don't have a farm, we don't have animals. So that changes kind of what we're eating. I'm a kind of a weirdo who makes strange ferments like boza, recreates them, and suans, and all these weird things from the past. And so generally there's a lot of unusual, strange things fermenting in my kitchen. So that's, I think, different. Although there are lots of things fermenting in your kitchen, Andrea, and often the the podcast supporters wonder if it's the washing fermenting as well. But
right now it's the chicken scrap bucket. Jacob didn't take it out yesterday, and when I was upstairs making my tea this morning, I could literally hear it bubbling. I was like, okay, no. Jacob needs to take this out.
So, talking of the chicken scraps and the farm, you have 4 kids there now, as of this summer. You have another one, so you have 4 children, and I have one child, So that changes the way that we cook and the kind of meals that we're producing, because you're feeding more mouths than me. My son, Gabriel, can't eat eggs or potatoes. And so Andrea, who, as we found out on the episode just to celebrate the end of the year, sometimes eats up to 10 eggs a day.
That would be my normal. That is my normal.
10 eggs by breakfast.
Yeah. By 8 o'clock, if there's not 10 eggs, how will I even function?
So there's a lot more egg situation going on in your house than there is in mine. Whereas I make a lot of bread. I think that's probably kind of where the scales tip towards me, because, I have my spelt cookbook, I have the rye course, I'm making bread with oats, I'm making gluten-free bread. I make a lot of bread. So we have a lot more bread, I think, in our house. We're different. And when you're listening in your kitchen, you're different. And as we know from going into Discord and talking with patrons, they're all different depending on where they are.
Yeah, we literally have kosher patrons.
Yeah.
So that's different. Like no lard there. We have patrons in cold parts of the world who don't have access to lots of the warm parts of the world type foods we have. Yeah. I mean, very, very different. We have patrons with huge gardens. Amazing. Patrons without gardens at all. Just very different.
Yeah, completely. But if you go back to those, principles we were talking about just before the ad about these are the things that are in common. These are the inspirational tenets we can take. We both cook in bulk, and we both purchase or harvest from our own farm in bulk, which in and of itself follows ancestral patterns. We both eat the food that's around us. We both make ferments and eat them. We both eat all the animal. We both eat proper fats. We're not scared of fat. And so our kitchens and what we're making and what we're feeding our families and how we're cooking that differs, but we're both using that philosophy, that idea of inspiration to guide our shopping habits, our growing habits, our processing habits, and our cooking and eating habits. Okay, so one of the other questions Nicole asked was talk about some figures in the ancestral eating world. And obviously the first figures that come to my mind are you and me. Which, 100
There's
podcasts
nothing else to say.
down.
All right, good episode, Alison.
End of it. So it's interesting that I think from my experience kind of just looking and seeing and kind of being a ding light bulb going off in my head when I see the word ancestral, I think the last year or so the word ancestral is being used more often in relation to this kind of diet. But also, some I know it's our influence in the world. Are we influencers yet?
Influencers.
Also, we you might see it described as traditional food. I find that a bit difficult because traditional food could be the thing that your grandmother cooked with a ton of sugar in and some Crisco,
Jello.
but it's traditional.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
Nutrient dense is perhaps a better label. But again, it's all these things have nuance, and people could take those phrases and use them in any way.
Sure.
So just listen to us. Anyway,
all natural.
Yeah, exactly. Protein rich. Anyway, there are some other people in the ancestral world other than us. So we need to talk about the Weston A. Price Foundation, which is named after a dentist called Weston A. Price, who travelled the world and saw how traditional cultures ate and wrote a book called Nutrition and Physical Degeneration. And
which
then
you can
Sally
read. You can still buy that book.
Yeah. I think you can even, maybe I got a PDF online, possibly.
What? Wow.
Sally Fallon is the head of the Weston A. Price Foundation. She created it and she wrote the book Nourishing Traditions, which we've got a couple of episodes on and probably will have another episode coming up this year on, which sometimes we call it the Ancestral Bible because it is. It's the first kind of book that just stamped these principles down. The Weston A. Price Foundation has kind of taken Weston A. Price's work and then built on it with Sally's own research and the guiding principles that she's added to. I feel like our focus is slightly different to Weston Price in that, first of all, we're focused really solely on the kitchen, but also I feel like we're more local. If you read Nourishing Traditions or you look at stuff on the Weston Price blog, there isn't so much of an emphasis on local as I think we have. Do you agree with me there, Andrea?
And there's, I think you can layer them, but I think that their focus tends to be more nutrient specific, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Like I'll say, get your vitamin A out of butter and lard.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll just use that as a saying. And then you and I would say, get your vitamin A out of butter and lard if you have them local to you, or there's, other places too that you can get it. I think both of us, Weston A. Price Foundation and us, would adhere certainly to the principles that Weston A. Price, the doctor himself, put down. I feel like that's a core that we're all in agreement on too, for sure.
Absolutely.
And it's a great, she put such a great influence into the world, in that she's worked so hard to, she had to fight against fat-free for decades. You know what I mean? So
she's the one who, we both started really with Nourishing Traditions, all that gave us the kick to move forward, and personally that book guided me in the principles. It guided me through my fat phobia into starting to eat fat again and brought back my fertility, so
I think if she's a little salty sometimes, I think she gets to be salty because she had to fight so hard. The world we live in now is so much more friendly to the idea of fat. It's still got some issues, but it's not as rigorously anti-saturated fat as like the 90s were.
Yeah, all credit to her for that book. That book is an absolute amazing piece of creative work. I think.
But it is, like you said, really big. Like the Bible, it's really big, and I know a lot of people do get kind of overwhelmed by it. So I know that our Nourishing Traditions episodes have been really helpful to people, and we're going to bring another one to you. That I did put it on the schedule for this year because I want to encourage people to get into that book because it does guide you on lots of wonderful things.
Yeah, absolutely. The other name that comes to my mind is someone we've mentioned already on this episode, who is Joel Salatin. Andrea, could you explain to listeners who don't know who Joel is, who he is, please?
Yeah, what does he say? He's the libertarian, ultra crazy something farmer.
Lunatic farmer.
The lunatic farmer. Yeah, that's ultra crazy. Yeah, so he's a farmer, and he's another person like Sally who has had to sort of fight his way upstream for a long time. Since the 80s, he's been pasturing his meat and basically having to explain to people why it's good for a chicken to be outside scratching in the dirt, coming from a world that saw no problem with cheaper factory chicken, if you will. And I know I've read a lot in his older books too, where he talked about kind of the struggle of just having to patiently basically teach classes and educate people on the value of meat that lived a natural animal life outside. So he's another person who you'll probably hear mentioned a lot because he has been trying to bring this awareness to us for such a long time. And he's written lots of farming philosophy books, which are very entertaining to read.
I think the Marvelous Pigness of Pigs is one of my favourite titles.
Yeah, okay. It is a great title.
Is there anyone else particularly that you want to mention who's kind of in the ancestral eating world, Andrea?
There are a lot of wonderful names. Those are kind of the big ones that spring to mind.
Yeah, there's lots of other bloggers who are doing stuff and some kind of semi-similar podcasts, but not quite. Modern Ancestral Mamas is the podcast, which a lot of our listeners listen to as well. And there are lots of kind of more health-focused podcasts based on ancestral principles as well. Okay, I think we're nearly at the end of episode 100. It feels amazing.
Oh my goodness.
To have basically 100 episodes recorded. I've talked to you.
I wonder how many hours we've
hundreds
spent
of time. Hours and hours.
Talking to each other on a microphone.
A very, very long time. Okay, so if people want to either start, maybe this is your first episode that you've listened to of our podcast, if so, welcome. Or if you want to move on your ancestral eating journey, there are lots of ways that you can be supported in doing that. The first one is our community, which you can join at various levels depending on your budget. And we have a Discord channel where we meet together, which has no adverts, no other things to distract you. It's all about ancestral food. And that is buzzing with lots of people, as Andrew said, from all over the world. And also, if you decide to join as a supporter, depending on what level you join, we have a monthly online chat where Andrew and I get on and talk to patrons, and we talk about the most wonderful things. And
it's true.
There's a lot more support available in that community, so that's a good place to look. We have some episodes as well, particularly that I wanted to point out. So the first one, which a lot of people comment on, is our episode 20 Small Steps to an Ancestral Kitchen. I will put these episodes in the show notes so you can click on them. That has a download associated with it. And in the episode, we talk through all the 20 steps in detail, talk about where we started, give you resources. There's a book list, I think. There's tons of stuff with that episode.
That's a really, really good episode for just getting started. And I know I've heard from a lot of people who are just wanting to change the way they eat. They know something's off. People have this instinct towards it. And they have told me that episode has been really helpful because people also come with a lot of emotional baggage and feelings of judgment against them and even against themselves for the way they eat. And I know that they have told me that episode really helps them to overcome some of those hurdles.
That's nice. I like the fact that it's small steps, like you said, with Nourishing Traditions, it can seem completely overwhelming. You've got this book with just hundreds and hundreds of pages and you don't know where to start.
Change everything.
We just say, no, just take one of these 20 and have a go at that and see what you think.
And have fun with it.
Okay, the next one is an episode we did a while back, which was the Ancestral Kitchen Challenge. And that is kind of similar in that there are, I think, tasks in it. And you can say, okay, I'm ready to try something. And you look at the list of all of these ideas that you could try and take one of them on. So we're kind of challenging you to say, okay, try this, try that. How about this? How about this?
And you can work on that list for a long time. I don't even know if you could do it in 1 year. It's pretty long.
Yeah, there's a lot. There's also an episode to go with that. So I will link the episode and the download in the show notes.
Thank you.
And then, of course, there's our cookbook, which if you join our community as a companion level, you will get a copy of, but is also available on our website, ancestralkitchenpodcast.com, to purchase or to gift to someone. So that has recipes that Andrew and I both put in there. It has pantry lists. It has equipment that we use. It has lots of inspiration and simple recipes, recipes that we use every day, week in, week out in our kitchens to put ancestral food on the table. That's
New York Times bestseller, 10 million copies sold. Hear my episode on Joe Rogan. That was
sorry, you just fast forwarded to 2026 there, didn't you, for a moment, I think. Okay. I think that might be it. What do you think, Andrea?
I really love this episode, Alison, and I think it's a great way to introduce people to what ancestral eating is. And like you said, it is so nuanced. It's even kind of hard to cram it into one episode, even though this is an hour and a half long or something. But those other episodes that you mentioned, the small steps, the Ancestral Kitchen Challenge, and even the ways to save money episode brings in a lot more detail on what ancestral food is, because there is a lot of nuance, and it is something that we would rather you engaged in a small way than avoided altogether because it was too overwhelming. So we want to welcome you into this life, and even if that means you're only going to try one thing for the next year, it's still a start.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Okay, onwards and upwards from episode 100 then, yeah?
Okay then, Alison, another year. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Bye.
Bye. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can join as a patron. Choose from various levels starting at $5. You can see what we offer at ancestralkitchenpodcast.com.
While you're there, check out our favourite books, supplements and kitchenware, or give a one-time donation.
Leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts.
And if you know someone who would love our show, tell them about us.
You are helping to bring ancestral food wisdom into modern kitchens, changing the world one plate at a time.